Was my research exhaustive? No. Is it premature to claim that this is the most advanced high school computer science course anywhere? Yes. Do I like rhetorical questions? You tell me. In this course, we're going to develop and deploy a full stack web application using what's called a framework. And the framework we're choosing, instead of Django, which is the more popular Python framework, we're going to use Flask because it's a micro framework. So this is Flask, and it's a micro framework. And read about it, please do. But what it's special about it is that it's so minimalistic. To add in a lot of the security and administration features that you'd expect of an app, we'll need to add each piece ourselves. We get greater control that way, but what's important for this class is that you'll see all of the components come together. But let's pull back for a second. We need to appreciate what we'll be building from a broader perspective. So right now you know that, well, hopefully you know that when you connect to a website, you're talking to a server. So you've got you on your computer, and you've got some computer providing you with the information over the internet, and that represented by this very minimalistic black line. Okay, so right now you probably have been somewhat comfortable with this idea, and that's a notion called the acceptable level of abstraction. And I'll bring this up from time to time because it can be frustrating while we're building something, and there's going to be a lot of parts of it that you don't understand, that I don't understand. There's so much to it. I know what a transistor is, on how what the fundamental underlying principle of what's powering a CPU, a processor. But there are so much of about that I really don't understand. I couldn't build you one, and so there's just been a point at which I say, yeah, processor, it has the on-off switches, and I could absolutely go into greater depth. But in order to stay focused on building what I want to build, I can't go too far into that. So there'll be times where I'll be glossing over some big concepts, and people might ask questions about it. And I will give you links, and I'll say, please investigate. But I'm keeping that within the acceptable level of abstraction, and just saying, yeah, the RAM works like this. And we're not going to talk about it too much more in this class because we need to go on to what's next. But we also need to, in places, lower your acceptable level of abstraction so that we can now uh, greater appreciate some of the background mechanics and that you'll need to consider as we're building web apps. For example, ICANN is the larger organization that helps control domain registrations. And so when you connect to a server, it's also looking up through DNS the registration that you've made in order to connect the IP of this server with the domain that you're punching into the web. And there's third-party verification going on as well, that most websites now are using HTTPS. They're using an SSL and encrypting the communication that's back and forth. And that also requires a verification by a third party. We're going to be using Let's Encrypt, and these sort of automated free SSL licenses, well, that's redundant. SSL means license, but these licenses that are so free and readily available right now are changing how the internet's being used. Now everything needs to go to HTTPS, or Google will prioritize you dead last, and you'll get no traffic. Now, you'll just need to know about most of these concepts in the general sense. Enough so that if you're having a problem with your SSL or your domain registration, that you'll have the keywords where you can start to Google things. And that's really what our first goal is to build an understanding of vocab, really, and it may be a little bit frustrating because you'll have to learn what a concept is before you're able to see what it looks like in code, or what the piece of hardware looks like. So this is just our first learning objective will largely be just to build that you understand what this word means, and then we'll put a greater experience behind it so that you can better understand, really what it means rather than just the vocabulary term. So like as I start to pick apart the parts of this server, my goal here is not that you memorize all of these right away, though you will learn all of these in the end. Our goal is to make sure that you understand some of the parts of us talking to a server. So the first thing that we're going to see is that the web request, once it gets routed over to our server that'll be running, and we might use what I'm using right now for my projects is DigitalOcean, and to remote control a server. And once it routes it to that DigitalOcean virtual server that I'm using, the web request will get picked up by a little app called Nginx. And then I need to get it to my Flask app, and that's what I was talking about before. So this will all be my Python code that runs this stuff, so my app. And to get it there, I need a gateway to connect the request over to Flask, and we'll use Whiskey or WSGI, and that's a gateway. So web request gets passed over by the gateway to the application, and the application here is going to be an MCV application. So model will be connected to a database. So our model will be laid out in Python, but then it gets recorded in SQL, and we'll talk more about that. So our model will be like a user has an email address and a first name, and so all of the properties that a model has, as well as all of the actions that a model can call. So a user might have a method that looks up their preferences or something like that. I don't know. I'm making stuff up. But the model might also have actions. Those actions are often not written down in the SQL server, but exist in the application's model schema. So this one is the higher priority because this one is the written down copy, and we need to protect it like you don't know what. But really, this will have greater detail because it also affects the logic of the app. And this is the brains of our app. And so it will remember the data, and then once it collects what it needs, it will pass along the view. So the view is actually sort of like our HTML template, and that will be where it fills in and say, "Welcome back, Mr. A," and it'll pull your name or your nickname from the database model, and it will build up the information and pass it over to the view, which puts together your little web page, and that gets routed back out to you. So those are the basic mechanics that we'll be building in this course. This is where we'll be spending most of our time, but setting all of this up, in my experience, has always been sort of the hardest part of web development. This part is more time consuming, but it's fun, and it's building, and it's creative, and sure, there's going to be frustrations along the way, but for the most part, it's a very enjoyable process. Setting this other stuff up can be tedious and a little bit tricky, but once you get it done, then it's very exciting. So this is sort of our semester. Now, what I always wonder when I was taking tutorial lessons, and I've taken a bunch of tutorials online, and you will take more stuff. You will relearn this stuff over and over again as you take different seminars and courses. If you get into this stuff. If you're just using this as a way to get an impression about how this web tech works and test to see if you're interested, maybe you decide you're not. That's no problem. But if you are really get into this stuff and you want to work directly on it or have some part of your professional experience involved with this stuff, oftentimes I will wonder, well, how does this work on a professional level? So this is a learning environment. So professionally, something like Pinterest might still use Nginx on their load balancer, and there's a billion different ways of setting up like a large scale app, and Pinterest I hear does use Flask. They may have changed their code base, but from what I understand, Pinterest uses Flask. And so they'll have a load balancer because no one app can handle all of the traffic that Pinterest gets. But so they'll have a load balancer that routes traffic to a bunch of different apps that are all running the same sort of Pinterest application software. And they might all reference the same database service. We'll be hosting our database right on the same little server where we're building the app. So we won't need a lot of power. But if you had a lot of users using your stuff simultaneously, you'd want your database to often be on a separate machine than your application. And so most people, well, okay, a growing number of businesses use cloud like database as a solution, meaning that they can just rent data space as they need it from AWS or Amazon Web Services, or like something like Google Cloud SQL. You can get a lot of horsepower to store your data without using on one of your machines, and you just pay for things as you use them. So if your website gets more powerful and it grows in size and demand, then your bill would grow with that. So that's sort of where a lot of this is going. So if you become very popular, we will break the connection. We will move your database off your application server and onto something like this, so that way you don't need to worry about it. You can just have a turnover, and as long as your app doesn't get more powerful than Amazon or in greater demand, then you'll be just fine. So for this, you're going to need to pick up some languages here. Command line interface is just the commands we'll type into the terminal, how we talk to a computer. We won't be clicking on stuff. A lot of this will be done remote control through text commands. It's not too hard, and I'll show you some resources on how to practice this stuff. We're going to learn a lot of Python. Most of this is going to be all in Python, but Python has a bunch of libraries or toolkits that come with it. And you'll need to know the commands and the sort of structure and concepts that toolkit uses, like Flask and SQL Alchemy, which Flask uses to write down its database. So these are going to be big things. And then HTML, CSS, these are not programming languages. This is a markup language, so that's the ML. And that just to design the pretty pictures and the web interface. Now, a lot of the JavaScript is taking this layer over and building something like using React or Vue to make this an actual application layer in it of itself. And so you have like a real-time native app feel in your app, and maybe even deploying the same thing to native apps in your iOS and Android marketplace. So JavaScript is taking this little thing over. For SQL, I should mention, we're not going to go too far into that. I'm still learning that myself. I'm really excited by that, and that's where I want to grow most, because that's just the way things are going. And JavaScript is a pretty cool application language. I mean, I like the elegance and simplicity of Python, but JavaScript is just very flexible and growing all sorts of ways. So the CLI will be to set up and work on our server. Python is our application and our database schema, or the pattern. We're going to build our look and feel with HTML and CSS and some JavaScript. And SQL will be very rarely used, and mostly just if we want to check on how our database is being written. SQL Alchemy is our ORM, which means it'll do the database stuff for us. no, so we'll learn Python to manage our database more than we'll actually learn SQL commands. And we are all going to work on a guide together as we go through this adventure. And so our first job is going to be reading this, setting these tools up, and filling out this vocabulary. We need to start doing some research and filling in all of these details.